Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, "Samuel, Samuel." And he said, "Here I am," and ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call. Lie down again." So he went and lay down, and the Lord called again, "Samuel." Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call, my son. Lie down again." But the Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go, lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Then the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears of it tingle. And on that day I will fulfill against Eli and all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them." Eli called Samuel and said, "Samuel, my son?" He said, "Here I am." Eli said, "What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you and more also, if you hide anything from me, all that he told you." So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. Then he said, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him."
Would you pray with me, please? God, be with us and unite us so that we are on one accord for the hearing, the understanding, and the carrying out of your message. Amen. So in seminary, they teach us you have to start your sermon with a joke, but there's not a lot of good jokes that you can tell in church. So I cheated. A few years ago, a group of researchers examined more than 1,000 jokes before whittling them down to a final 50. And then they had 36,000 people vote on which one was their favorite. And what you're going to hear next is joke number 1. It's entitled, "Just Two Things." A woman gets on a bus with her baby, and the bus driver says, "That's the ugliest baby I've ever seen." The woman walks to the rear of the bus and sits down, fuming. She looks over at the older gentleman next to her and says to the man, "That driver just insulted me." The man says back to her, "There's two things wrong with that. Number one, no young lady deserves to be talked to like that. And number two, nobody should be that rude to you and not get a piece of your mind in return." He continued, "You go up there and tell him off. Go on, I'll hold your puppy for you." Just two things. Today is about just two things. This morning I have the privilege and responsibility of speaking to the students that for the next year will be on their confirmation journey. So if you all don't mind. Fortunately for me, our scripture is the quintessential confirmation story. It's one that pretty much tells itself. For the most part, it's a story so simple even a youth minister could tell it. Matter of fact, the way I see it, there are just two things that present a challenge to us in our understanding of this story. Samuel, a young man serving in the house of the Lord, is having a difficult night sleeping because 3 times throughout the night he is awakened with a very clear voice calling his name. After a couple of times, Eli, who is the high priest of the temple who Samuel was serving under, realizes what is going on and tells Samuel that it is not he, Eli, that is calling Samuel, but God. He instructs the young man to go back to bed, and if the call comes again, rise up and say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." So the first challenge is that it's easy to assume that the context for Samuel was so drastically different than the context that you and I and these confirmands find ourselves in today. Admittedly, in this post-Herald camping world that we live in, when I hear somebody who's claiming to hear the voice of God, I expect to be embarrassed or offended rather than inspired or challenged. But apparently, the voice of God was not readily present, as we might assume, such to the point that it is the very first thing we are told in the beginning of the story. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. I'm not sure if the fact that even thousands of years ago the worshiping community was having trouble discerning the voice of God is discouraging or reassuring. Either way, it suggests to me that the theological, ecclesiological, political, sociological leaders of the day were so in discord with one another that it was all but impossible to figure out which voices were reflective of the real voice of God. And I don't know about you, but that sort of rings a bell for me. Voice of God aside, I'm sure it's difficult for you to liken yourselves to an adolescent who's falling asleep in the middle of the darkness of the temple when more and more of us fall asleep with our television on, headphones in our ears, and texting devices in our hands. But nonetheless, the scriptures tell us that by the time God was calling out to Samuel, the temple lamp had not yet burned out, which scholars suggest meant that the one lamp that remained lit in the temple throughout the night was about out of oil, which suggested that it was a peak hour in the middle of the night. So regardless then of your differences in how you fall asleep, I know that you, today's teens, know fatigue and you know darkness. You know the fatigue of exhaustive expectations, institutional bullying, and the fatigue of the pressures of having to blend in while stand out. Should have been standing out. I don't do grammar. And you know darkness, don't you? You know the darkness of isolation, confusion, betrayal, and addiction, just like anybody else in this room. And I think our prayer for you, confirmands, is that in understanding the first challenge, to understand that you and Samuel have a lot in common. I think the prayer is that we and you will look at yourselves, look at Samuel, and see much of the same thing. The second challenge presented in this text is that its concise nature makes it easy to overlook the fact that Samuel's calling was not easily received or executed. It's easy to assume that this is a much more realistic setting for Samuel than for us because he's in the Bible and we're not. But let's not forget that before this section of 1 Samuel, we heard Hannah's song. Hannah, the mother of Samuel, the son she never thought she was going to have, dedicates her son back to the temple in thanksgiving for the blessings that God had bestowed upon her. Did you catch that? That means, yes, Samuel was called by God, and his mother had to drag him to church too. Again, I don't know about you, but that rings a bell for me. It's important, I think, to remember that what God calls Samuel to do next is not easy. He had bad news he was going to have to deliver. What God revealed to Samuel was, according to Rolf Jacobson, an announcement of God's judgment on Eli and his house, especially his sons, who are told in the chapter before are blasphemous with their possessions in the temple. Quoting, "On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them." Yes, Samuel had bad news for Eli. The church was going to have to change, and for the church, sometimes there is no scarier news than change. For you confirmands, our prayer for you is twofold, just two things. That you confront the understanding that you are a vessel of God's will for this world right now. And that the church with lowercase c and the church with a capital C, we'll talk about the difference later, both need you right now. And most importantly, our prayer for you will be that in the darkness and fatigue that looms near and around you, you will hear the clear, gentle, booming voice of God calling out to you. And be ready to, like Samuel, answer in that moment, "Here I am." Beginning during our prayer this morning, we will light that Paschal candle over there by the baptismal font, which will remain on the chancel. And each Sunday throughout your confirmation journey, when we bring in the flame that represents the burning presence of Christ's Spirit among us, we will intentionally, with the same flame, light that Paschal candle in the hopes that God's presence will be within you during your journey, and in the recognition and confidence that God's presence will shine through you into our midst and transform our lives as you are being transformed. And I think the hardest part for our church will be to stay back and not try to define too much of this experience for our confirmation class. I heard the story recently of an 8-year-old girl who wanted to do something special for her parents on their anniversary. As a present, this young girl was going to wake up extra early and make her parents breakfast in bed. You and I both know that in this situation, cereal and toast would have been the way to go. But that's not the way it went. She brought out the milk and the eggs and the pancake mix and the blueberries. She was going to make blueberry pancakes. And you and I both know that these aren't good odds for an 8-year-old, but this breakfast was going to be special. And I guess special is one word you could call it. It started out manageable enough. An eggshell year, a couple of extra drops of milk on the counter there, a pile of mix on the floor here, and a blueberry stained handprint on the kitchen cabinet there. It wasn't until the gallon of milk was knocked over near the edge of the Korean counter, sending an egg or two to the floor, which distracted the girl for enough time to let the uncapped milk pour over onto the floor with her back turned, that she realized she was in trouble. By the time her father made it to the kitchen, he was able to see milk, eggs, pancake mix, all over the kitchen and the floor that had been mopped the night before, all surrounding the girl who was holding one measly blueberry-stained dish towel in her hand. I'm sure we all can imagine her embarrassment, horror, and guilt. What started out as a wonderful idea for a wonderful day had completely, I mean completely backfired. She lost all control. Bracing for the punishment, or even worse, the disappointment, the little girl knelt down into the milk, balled up her fists into her eyes, and began to cry. She was so devastated. So devastated that it took her a few moments to realize what her dad did next. Before he spoke, before he uttered a single word, her daddy smiled gently, hitched up his robe, stepped into the kitchen, sat down right beside her in the milk, and took her into his lap and held her. See, I think we grown-ups sometimes think that we are called upon to fix all of the problems that we step into. I think us churchy folks do the same thing. At least I know this borderline churchy, borderline grown-up is especially bad at assuming that what I have to offer the world are answers and solutions. Boy, am I wrong on so many levels. We care a lot about you guys. And so it will be all that we can do to not want to answer the questions of faith for you, discern the calling of God for you, and articulate God's love through you in the way which excites us most. But the truth is, trying to tell you in 20 minutes what your confirmation journey is going to be about makes about as much sense as having a panel of people vote on what joke is the best of all time. In a world that is already too busy, too overbooked, too multitasked, I think it's essential, folks, that we remember that the most precious gift we can give one another is the willingness to sit down in the mess and be with one another.